Hi. So this is a series of interviews, starting with myself actually, and Devon Blandin is going to be my interviewer, where we're going to try and get as many of the interesting stories out of people who've been at Artsy for a while, and try and extract that, turn it into something public, and make it something that is valuable for everybody. The reason I'm doing this is my last week, and I feel like these stories are things that will be very hard to capture later than in comparison to today. So I'm definitely going to grab our CTO at Artsy, and hopefully I should be able to grab our COO and maybe even our CEO to kind of talk about what we've all been doing for the last 7, 8, 9 years. And to try and dig into how we tick, how Artsy has changed over that time frame, and what are our hopes for the futures, and what kind of kept us here for that long. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. Let's go.
Awesome. Do you want to start us at the beginning? How did you first get involved with Artsy?
Sure. So I kind of looked out actually. I have a history of working at companies that fail after a year or two, and one of those companies was actually out in Brazil doing Ruby and Mac dev. It was a very small niche back then. Well, both of those are small niches back then. And the guy that hired me when that startup failed came back to New York City, and Artsy tried to hire him. He was like, I don't have time to do that, but he did have time to do it as a moonlighter project, and in order to pull that off, needed somebody that was full time to do a lot of the rest of the work around that. So I was hired as a lot of his kind of helper on shipping what was our first Artsy app, which is a portfolio tool for art galleries, and the idea being roughly that we wanted to give something back to our partners. Artsy makes money buying and selling fine art on the internet, but at the time we didn't even have a website. So we'd have all these partners that would give us all this data, and we'd have nothing to show for it. So I was hired to work on effectively a tool that gave them their data back, and in a useful, beautiful way that they could then use to take to galleries and to show off to their clients and have the archives of all of their work. It's interesting. I shipped a version of it yesterday, and so for this whole 7.5 years, it's constantly been something that I've still worked on and kind of cherished with my time.
And how would you describe your role now? Maybe we can bookend, and then dive into some middle parts.
Perfect. So I think my role now is kind of complex. When I try to describe it to other engineers, I describe it a little bit like being a janitor of many code bases. I might not necessarily own them, but I'll jump in and be very useful to them in short time periods. That's meant that I've had the ability to contribute in so many different places, and Artsy is a very complicated set of systems because we have multiple businesses, and each one of those businesses is effectively its own startup, and for a long time has been ran as its own startup. So they all have had their own little cultures that meant they had different technology choices, and so a lot of my work in the last few years has been working with people that are trying to consolidate things. So we have what we call now the Artsy omakase, which is one way of saying if you're going to work on iOS or if you're going to work on web, then you're going to use this set of dependencies, and we'll be very cautious about adding new things, but we'll try and make sure that everything that is in that works seamlessly together. And so I really enjoy the sort of breadth of that sort of role. It quite traditionally is considered very much a platform or an infrastructure role, but one of the cool things about being here for so long is that I've had the freedom to jump between working on APIs to working on the front end to working on tools for the front end, and so it's really hard to kind of easily reconcile what my role is now. Some of the closest things I've ever heard to that are architects at big companies where their job is not necessarily to actually build things, but to just come in and be useful to other teams for very short periods of time. And maybe, if Artsy was much bigger, then that's probably what that role or responsibility might be. But realistically, for the size that we're at, which is about 30 in engineering, that's probably about, well, we don't need that level of abstraction yet. And maybe we'll at 100, 200, but for now, someone that can come and contribute code in almost anywhere at any time is a very useful abstraction, and really something that you can only do once you've been doing it for a very long time, and that you've tried to keep on top of almost every code base in the company. And that's a little bit exhausting, but kind of worth it.
And how did you make yourself to this? How did you lead yourself to this role? Like, is this something you've wanted for a long time? Like this particular like professional career trajectory? Has your time at Artsy, changed that direction at any point, or I don't know?
Does a little bit. So like that's a really interesting one because my career trajectory was pretty traditional for a while, which was I joined Artsy as a junior-ish engineer working with someone who knew what he was doing, and then when he left, I had to take over a bunch of things. And so I went from like maintaining a few features to maintaining a code base, and then suddenly we realized that maybe iOS Artsy should be a thing. So suddenly I went from being can own a code base to can own 2 code bases and to manage a team. And then I was manager of many people at Artsy, and I hired like a lot of people who are still here today. And then that moved into, well, what if we do React Native? And then suddenly we don't necessarily need an iOS team in the same sort of cultural space as we did. And so that kind of suddenly meant that there was all this idea that if we're going to share code across iOS and web, then we need some sort of like central way of discussing all that. And so we sort of created the front end at Artsy, and then I kind of led that until I didn't need to lead that because there were other people that were leading that, and I was doing something else. And so my career trajectory is about as random as my open source trajectory, which is also the same. It's like, well, we might need to use this thing called Cocoa Pods. It seems like the right abstraction. And then looking at it and being like, oh, there's so much room for improvement here. And then that's the next 6 years of my life. and then Apple take this, they recreate the same idea, and I'm like, wait, that frees me to do other things. And so like I start working on things like Danger, and trying to like start really taking the JavaScript ecosystem seriously. Wearing a Jest t-shirt right now, for example. I think it's really, I have a very non-traditional career path now simply because of my like ability to do breadth. And Artsy talks a lot about the idea of looking for T-shaped programmers. So that's people with quite a reasonable chunk of breadth, but usually quite a lot of depth. And whilst I definitely have a lot of depth in like native skills, to some extent they're not as useful as they used to be. And so what ended up happening is that sort of top of the T started just getting wider and wider. So maybe I'm like, I don't know if there's a really long shape with a little thing down that would be a better fit. And so it's that breadth that really is like what kind of defined my career nowadays, which is like the ability to contribute to many things in a shallow way. And sometimes that's like a really big advantage. Like, in the past week I probably contributed to about 5 or 6 big open source projects, and I'm working on redesigns for a lot of very large open source projects. But the trade-off there is like, I don't do the deep stuff. So like going and working on some fundamental re-architecting or things like that, I just generally don't find too interesting, and tend to like dive in, do some shallow contributions that make things like, what's the right, like a linchpin, something that's like really small but adds a ton of value, and then move on to the next thing and just keep doing that in a billion different places, and eventually that sort of raises the quality for everyone. And so now I think at Artsy I found the freedom to be able to like have such a non-traditional path to both contributions on the open source and both internally within Artsy. And I think that like, having a culture like we do that allows for people's growth to be non-traditional is something that like is really valuable, and is something that I'll miss moving to a very large company. But I don't know, I'm really satisfied with the last 7.5 years, and it's really helped me find my way to get in without feeling like other people are like, this is how you have to be, rather than just saying like, well, he seems to be doing all this stuff, let's just let that happen, and eventually we'll give it a name, that'll be fine. So yeah, my career in Artsy has like shifted in many different ways, and I think that's just like part of startup culture maybe. Like I remember DB once said that like the growth of a company sort of gives this space for constant fissures. So like you have this much responsibilities for the entire team, but suddenly bang, you now have this, and there's little gaps in between that get filled out, and like the way in which you get filled out is by trying to deprecating yourself regularly, and that can be done by like process where you have, you know, a document that defines some of the things that you do, and then you can pass it on to the next person, that passes on to the next person. We do that with stand-ups. There's like deprecation via just straight up training people to do exactly what you've done before, or there's like just straight up delegation. It's like, hey, I was leading this practice and now suddenly, well, these other people are doing a much better job of it anyway, so we may as well just outright call you that thing, and then that leaves me to like find the next fissure and to sort of work on those problems. And I think that's a really like healthy way to kind of adopt to a growing company.
You want to talk a little bit about open source at Artsy and like Artsy's image in the iOS and mobile communities, or maybe I'll do that one.
Yeah, sure. I take branding and design very, very seriously. Mainly in part because like a lot of it's, you know, messaging and how do you describe things to the rest of the world, but a lot of it's also like, I think there's a lot of value in the stuff that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, and I really want to see the rest of the world like understand that and to learn from that. I know that I grew up in a small town in the middle of England, no access to other engineers, and I had to learn entirely by reading the open source code from people that were like, you know, building the Mac apps that I admired. And the tricky thing from that was then that like all I got was the end result of their work. And so you kind of have to go from the end result and try and like dive in backwards and figure out like how did they make these decisions? Why did they turn out this way? What does it even look like to work with these people? Like I was still very young to the open source like ethos. You know, you kind of start off in read-only mode and then eventually you start turning into read-write. Like sometimes I feel like I'm a write-only occasionally because it's like turn-off issues. But the thing here is like I wanted Artsy to be able to like showcase our process in a way that other people can understand. And I think it's super valuable that we kind of got most of the way towards open source by default, where a lot of our work is done in the open, and it makes it very easy for us to share and like give back, and more importantly, to some people, like the ability for us to showcase the things that we're doing that could be not perfect, or could be like, here's the bug, here's the exact use case, because you can just clone our repo and look at it there and then. And when you're doing some of like the really, really deep problems, that's a perfect answer to like giving a reproduction case in the exact context right there, rather than having to, you know, create something that fakes it or does something similar. And so for me, one of the things that was interesting is that like no one ever said no. Like there's this blog post that just kind of details every single step we did in like going from not quite open source by default in like 2012 all the way to like 2015, where all of the front end is open source by default. And like, you know, I would send these emails to the entire team, and send emails to like our CEO and COO and the CTO, and just be like, this is what we're thinking of doing in the next month or two. And every time I get back like, yeah, do that, that's great, good on you. And like, we just kept pushing it, and eventually got to a point where like the only repos that were not open source were because they probably shouldn't be. And like the idea of open source by default was just like, well, that's what we're at now, because nobody said no, and to some extent nobody's still saying no either. It's just like there's not much value in some of the things that we haven't open sourced at this point. And so it's really like a credit to the leadership level at Artsy that they dig, that they know what we're doing. And like the only kind of question the key question I asked when I was interviewing at Artsy was like, are the co-founders technical? Because I've worked at companies where they weren't, and it was very hard to kind of either like ship something to open source, even just as a library, but also just like the sort of the dissonance between the things that engineers want and need sometimes, and the things that like marketing-based CEOs need and want can be quite far. And if you want to be like an engineering team, you really need to make sure that all the way up to leadership, people understand what's going on. And so we're quite lucky at Artsy to have the co-founders as, you know, Princeton Dorm Comp Sci, and I think it's Bell Labs research engineer. That just means that they understand the terminology when we talk about these things, and like maybe it's been a very long time for them, but they still get the underlying principles when we say like this is how engineering should work, and we'll work towards that over the course of many years, and they're just like, sure, good luck.
And how have the business needs from the engineering team changed over time? Like back when Artsy was on like TechCrunch, stage to now, because the product organization has seen a lot of change, particularly in the past year. How would you kind of like describe that journey?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I like that every single question. It's like that's a good question. Sure. So I think this one is interesting because for the first maybe 6 years of Artsy, it was just constant. This is entire new business that we need to build. That ranged from like at the start, which is like taking galleries online. That then moved to taking museums online because museums are a great source of artworks and we want to put all that on there so that you feel like you do a search for the Mona Lisa and it turns up. You wouldn't get that in a contemporary art gallery, so you need to have these institutions that have this sort of breadth. You then go from like institutions to be like where's the central place for nearly all artworks in the world outside of institutions, and that turns out to be art fairs. So we created art fairs on Artsy, and then that was great. And then the next problem was like, okay, so now we need to look at the next place where the most expensive artworks are bought because they don't tend to be at fairs. That's in the auction houses. So how do you get there? Well, first you start doing not the auction houses, but benefit auctions, and use benefit auctions to start building this system of like how do we do live auctions and how do we try and replicate an auction online anyway? It's a tricky problem. So we did that, and then we moved to live, and then we started thinking, well, somewhere along that line, we started saying, oh, we need an editorial team, so we need to start like building the infrastructure for doing like Artsy magazine, and all of these things are like creating lots of things from scratch, and trying to like build something up at first in the most minimal possible thing, and like sometimes that was just a CSV and like a small database somewhere, and then it would be like, after a month or two, we would know what that CSV should look like, and so we can do the data in a proper way, and then just throw up a Rails admin on it. But by the end of like 2017, it was starting to look like the things that we needed to build now were not like the breadth of the platform, but like maybe the depth of the platform, but more like I think the icing on top of this cake. Like we built a lot of these small, maybe not small, we built a lot of these large like businesses, and we're starting now to think like what is the layer that we can put on top of that. And the sort of the problem domain of like working across many businesses is very different from the product domain of like building one business straight vertical. And so we had a lot of need for like communication across many different aspects of this business. Artsy's like about 250 people together, and like trying to ship something that affects like institutions, galleries, fairs, auctions, like the new selling options, those kind of things are a massive amount of communication overhead. And so we had to like rethink how we do product management, how we organize our dev teams, how we organize the way in which we structure our time. All of these things gave us the ability to like work at a sort of higher level of abstraction that allows us to work above all the businesses rather than specifically on each one business. Because if we only worked on each one business, then it's much harder to keep this kind of cross communication going. And like it's a testament to Artsy that we managed to get so far by just like continuing to try and maintain all these separate little businesses while we build the next one. But it's a testament to where Artsy is today that we can actually build like a lot of things that sit atop all this infrastructure, and gives us the ability to do some like machine learning things that we never had the ability to do, and gives us the ability to do things like local discovery, which is the maps thing on the iPhone app. That's something that has been in discussion for like 5 or 6 years, and we finally got it done this year. And it takes like another level of communication and like tooling and things like that to build that only now Artsy has the capability to do. So that was the change, and I think it makes a ton of sense for the size and the scope of what we're doing now.
Yeah. What do you think are like some of the challenges that the product organization has going forward? Like if you were to give advice to someone just joining the product team and you want them to continue the great culture we have here and some of the best practices that we've established, what would be that advice?
I think a lot of the best advice I can give to people is that like it's bad advice, but it's advice, is that sometimes working on things on your own and in your spare time can get you very far in terms of like trying to sort of work around a featured bug. So think about it as like, you know, on Artsy time I can work on things like CocoaPods and I can work on like a lot of our other dependencies because we consider those things we own. But sometimes in order to do like interesting technical spikes, you might just really have to do that out of hours. And like Artsy has structure for this as well. This is why it's bad advice, right? Like I'm telling you to not just do your job, but also if you want to really, really progress in your career, like if you want to be industry scale, then you really have to unfortunately put the time in. And whether you want to do that or not is like a totally fine thing to choose, and like it's entirely everyone's choices. But like that's the choice I made specifically, and that like the work I wanted to do at Artsy would like affect ideally the entire industry, and depending on what industries you're working with. But like all of iOS is pretty small and pretty easy. All of JavaScript a bit trickier, but got there eventually. And the only way in which we could do some of this stuff is really to like work out of hours on it. And is that worth it for you? Is a trade-off that you should be making on your own. But it was a trade-off that worked for me, and I'm okay with what is effectively overworking to make that work. But like Artsy will get you like 60% of the way there. But if you want to get the final 40, like realistically, like you have to kind of live and breathe programming, which is neither good advice, but it depends on what you want. And so Artsy is the kind of place where you can actually go and be like it can be a rocket ship for both your career and the impact that you have if you're willing to take the sort of scale and impact that we can do at Artsy and like open source by default, and like some of the pre-existing work that we've done on like letting people know that Artsy engineers exist, making it so that we have an easy blog to do new cool things with, and to showcase your voice. Not having like an artsy voice on the blog, so like you talk in your style, like you own that. Those kind of things can help you like be a rocket on your career. It doesn't have to be that way for everybody, and it shouldn't be that way for everybody, but you can use that if you choose. And I mean that's what I did, and it got me pretty far. So I don't know if that's good advice. It's definitely bad advice. Like like not everyone should be taking that. But if those trade-offs are acceptable to you, which are pretty high, but I think this is one of there's not many places in the world where you can use the company's like ethos and business ideas and like value system to actually like further your own career in a substantial way. Like you can go from just being a simple product engineer to like known by all of the people that build the things that you want to be using, and that's a super unique position to be in. Right. So if you're an Artsy engineer, you actually get the chance to do that, and you might not in many other places. So yeah, it's bad advice, but you're in one of the few places where you can do that. I think that's what makes it okay advice.
Especially now, because that foundation exists. You know, there are all of these ways in which to take advantage.
Yep. You just get to build on the shoulders of people with good hats.
Hat tip. And I guess more to your personal experience of being at Artsy, you know, you've been influential in setting up this foundation upon which, you know, other engineers can progress their career. But like, how has working at Artsy kind of changed the way you look at the industry, kind of changed the way you approach your work or your personal projects or your open source contributions?
I think at heart, Artsy gave me something worth working on. So like, I've worked at a bunch of different startups, and I never had the sort of level of commitment to like the sort of owning of the dependencies and the ability to like feel inspired to build the things that I build and to move in the direction that I inevitably did. Like the ability to sort of commit to a single idea for 7.5 years is definitely not easy anyway, but having that idea being so good and like having everyone else in the team working on that idea being so interesting and diverse meant that like this kind of company is a really nice amalgamation of a lot of the sort of properties that I would love to have if I was ever building a business, which I won't. I'll probably just have it like free people and it'll be nice and calm and it'll be really chill. But I would miss something like this, and this is the kind of ideal workspace that I would look for.